Instantly claiming central territory, this pawn advance opens diagonals for bishops and prepares for swift piece development. Immediately contesting the center establishes equality and opens lines for developing pieces. Developing the knight here pressures black's central pawn, initiating a common opening dance that aims for rapid piece deployment. Developing the knight here naturally contests the e4 pawn and prepares for castling, solidifying the kingside early. Instantly, the bishop aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and threaten the knight, creating a tense, dynamic position where black must react carefully. Challenging the bishop's influence, this knight's advance prepares to break the pawn center and unleash its latent attacking potential. Securing the monarch against immediate threats streamlines development and prepares for central action, a prudent step after the opening skirmish. Brave but perhaps premature, the knight's venture deep into enemy territory risks isolation. Leveraging the pinned knight, white aims to exploit black's vulnerable pawn structure by regaining material control of the center. Retreating the knight allows it to defend the pawn and prepares to contest central space. Sacrificing the pawn opens a path to attack the slightly exposed black king, creating immediate tactical possibilities and putting pressure on black to defend precisely. Developing the bishop here prepares to castle kingside, a crucial step towards king's safety and a more harmonious pawn structure. This piece, now active on the diagonal, also exerts gentle pressure towards the center and supports potential pawn breaks. It's a sound developing maneuver, prioritizing defensive solidity and unified piece play. Gaining tempo and redeploying the bishop to a safer square, preparing for the pawn push d4. Exchanging the knight now, while seemingly simplifying, surrenders the central tension and allows white's rook to find a more active diagonal, potentially pressuring the kingside later. Reclaiming the pawn with the rook initiates a dynamic pawn structure and immediately challenges black's central presence. This recapture reestablishes material equality while opening the e-file for potential future pressure, a crucial consideration given the king's still exposed position. Castling now finally secures the king, but it leaves the e-file somewhat unprotected from white's rook, potentially leading to exchanges that might favor white's more active pieces if black isn't careful. Embracing the initiative, white injects pawn presence into the center, creating a dynamic imbalance and seeking to unravel black's slightly passive setup by opening lines and activating pieces, aiming for a central advantage that could later translate into attacking opportunities or strategic pressure on black's king. Re-establishing the bishop's influence on the long diagonal, this knight detour now frees up the f-pawn, potentially opening lines towards the king if white isn't careful with their central pawn structure. It's a subtle repositioning that challenges white's initiative. Reasserting control over the d-file, this rook's return prepares to challenge black's imposing bishop pair and potentially exploit weaknesses around the king if it remains tucked away. It's a strategic repositioning that signals a desire for active piece play and a more dynamic struggle in the center, rather than passively waiting for black to consolidate. Re-establishing the rook on an open file, black aims to contest the central breathing room and prepare for potential pawn pushes, subtly influencing the board's geometry. Suddenly, the center opens up, creating dynamic possibilities and increasing the tension for both kings as pawns advance. Liberating the c8 bishop while simultaneously challenging the central pawn advance, this maneuver aims to rebalance the queenside and foster piece activity. Solidifying the central pawn chain, white anchors the d5 pawn and prepares for potential pawn advances or piece repositioning without fearing an immediate d5 push from black. A proactive bishop redeployment, this square offers a clear diagonal, potentially eyeing the kingside if the center opens up, while also providing a retreat path should the queenside become congested. Exchanging the rook this way clears the way for white's other pieces to actively participate, potentially opening up the king's defense or creating opportunities on the central files. Accepting the exchange simplifies the position, releasing some pressure and preparing the queen for more active involvement on the d-file, where control will be paramount in the coming middle game. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure, G3 aims to provide a safe haven for the king and prepare for potential kingside action or simply to fortify the pawn chain. Re-establishing contact with the queenside, this bishop move aims to challenge white's entrenched pieces and potentially open lines for counterplay. Asserting influence over the central dark squares and preparing for potential kingside expansion. Recapturing that pawn immediately opens up lines and creates dynamic play, but it also places your queen in a slightly exposed position, potentially becoming a target for your opponent's developing pieces. The queens have been exchanged, initiating a transition into an endgame where white's bishop on f1 now has a much more expansive scope. A crucial pawn sacrifice is completed here, opening diagonals for the queen and creating significant piece activity, all while trading down towards a simplified middle game. Exchanging the bishop for black's knight fundamentally alters the pawn structure and opens up the d-file, potentially creating endgame advantages for white if capitalized upon. A pawn structure now emerges, dictating future play. Black's central pawns are now isolated but provide a potential outpost for a knight later, while white controls the open e-file and enjoys a slight lead in development. Knight embarks on a positional journey, aiming to reposition from the slightly awkward d2 square, potentially to a more active central outpost or a supporting wing role, while simultaneously reinforcing the c4 pawn and preparing to contest control over the d-file. Shifting the rook to the e-file now, black aims to contest the only open file, creating potential for future activity or a forced exchange that might relieve some pressure. Focusing on improving the bishop's placement, white repositions the light-squared bishop to a more active diagonal where it can influence the center and potentially prepare for a kingside expansion. The bishop's retreat to c6 completes the consolidation of black's queenside pawns, creating a formidable defensive barrier and preparing for potential queenside expansion, while simultaneously challenging white's central pawn advances and aiming to disrupt the harmonious placement of white's pieces. Asserting dominion over the central files, this rook's repositioning seeks to pry open the d-file, potentially creating endgame advantages. Black shores up the central pawn structure, creating a more solid pawn chain and preventing white's knight from immediately hopping to c4 or e4. This move also prepares to activate the bishop on b7, potentially contesting the important d-file. Reclaiming the initiative on the queenside, the knight embarks on a journey to reinforce the d5 pawn and potentially eye the vulnerable queenside squares. The rook's decisive entry onto the second rank is a bold assertion of influence, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and liberate black's pieces from their defensive postures. Consider how this aggressive positioning might create immediate tactical opportunities or force white into unfavorable exchanges as they defend their compromised king's shield. The knight's retreat to its original square offers a measure of security, yet it relinquishes the central outposts it had tentatively established, leaving the d-file relatively unpressured for black's rooks to exploit. A bold pawn thrust to destabilize white's central pawn chain and open attacking avenues for the rook. Shifting the monarch away from the central files and potential bishop diagonals addresses the encroaching black pieces and secures the king's safety, setting up for a more mobile development of the remaining pieces. The rook swings back, seeking refuge on the second rank and preparing to defend the d-pawn. Opening up the c-file now solidifies white's pawn structure, creating a safe harbor for the knight on b3 and offering it a potential sortie towards the center. Black solidifies their pawn structure, aiming to create a protected passed pawn on the d-file while simultaneously reinforcing the c6 bishop. This decision strategically centralizes the bishop, preparing it for potential future operations against white's kingside, and signals a commitment to positional maneuvering rather than immediate tactical fireworks. Clearing the central file opens a direct confrontation for control of the d-file, potentially leading to aggressive piece activity for white's knights once the queens are exchanged, and challenging black's pawn structure. Reclaiming the bishop asserts black's presence in the center and prepares to contest the open d-file, a crucial pathway for both sides' remaining pieces. Initiating a forceful rook invasion to seize the open d-file now offers a clear path to activity, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and exploit potential weaknesses. Asserting presence on the central d-file with this pawn thrust aims to solidify black's pawn chain and potentially hinder white's knight development, while simultaneously preparing to contest the open files with future pawn advances or piece activity. Expanding the queenside pawn structure with a pawn advance aims to secure additional territory and restrict black's minor pieces from finding active squares. Consolidating the kingside presence by the black monarch shores up a previously exposed flank, anticipating potential pawn storms or harassment in the approaching middle game complexities. Unlocking the queenside pawns to challenge black's advanced central pawn is the objective, aiming to disrupt their pawn structure and create potential weaknesses. Reclaiming central influence and preparing to challenge the semi-open d-file, this maneuver activates the rook, hinting at future pawn pushes to destabilize white's queenside structure. This pawn push bravely stakes a claim on the queenside, aiming to create an unstoppable passed pawn while simultaneously restricting black's bishop. Seeking to pry open the queenside, black's rook surges to f6, eyeing the advanced white pawn on b5 and preparing to challenge the central pawn majority black is attempting to establish. The rook's repositioning to the second rank aims to support the central pawn majority and prepare for a potential pawn breakthrough, while also eyeing the possibility of doubling rooks on the d-file if the knight can be dislodged. The king's central placement now becomes a liability. It should retreat to safety behind the pawn shield before the opponent's knights can exploit the open lines. Unleashing a pawn to contest the queenside initiative, 31. a5 immediately challenges black's control and seeks to disrupt their coordinated pieces, aiming to create imbalances before the queenside becomes entirely locked down. Opening the queenside pawns like this, while seemingly creating space, allows white to establish a strong outpost for their knight on c4, potentially dominating the queenside and forcing black into a passive defense. The knight's repositioning to a5 suddenly injects dynamism, aiming to exploit the potential weakness of black's isolated c5 pawn while simultaneously eyeing the b7 square. This aggressive cavalry maneuver signals white's intent to break free from passive defense and engage in a more active struggle for central influence and potential pawn advances on the queenside, potentially forcing black into uncomfortable defensive choices. Unleashing the rook to the b-file, black aims to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and create counterplay along the newly opened open file, a crucial maneuver in this endgame where pawn weaknesses will ultimately decide the victor. Cleverly exploiting the open knight file, this maneuver forces a critical pawn structure decision, potentially isolating black's central pawns and opening a diagonal for white's bishop. Shifting the monarch to that square is a gamble. While it dodges the immediate knight check, it exposes the king to potential pawn thrusts on the queenside, potentially creating an unmanageable weakness as the pawns on that side are now isolated and vulnerable. A decisive check that cleaves the position open, forcing a significant pawn structure change and potentially simplifying into a favorable endgame for white. Shattering the central pawn structure, this capture opens up immediate attacking avenues for black's rooks, forcing white's king to contend with potentially vulnerable diagonals and underscoring the importance of active piece play in the ensuing complexities. The rook slides across the 7th rank, a powerful assertion of control, now eyeing the weakened d4 pawn and threatening to infiltrate black's position. The rook's journey to b5 injects immediate life into black's position, aiming to untangle the pawn structure and potentially activate the queenside. While it snags a pawn, this liberation comes at the cost of exposing the king to further pressure along the open d-file and the diagonal created by white's knight. Consider how this rook might support a future pawn advance or contest the now semi-open b-file. The rook repositions to the 8th rank, a classic maneuver for activating a rook in an endgame and a decisive step to gain control of the open file. Unlocking the b-file opens new possibilities for black's rook, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure on the queenside while simultaneously reinforcing the passed a pawn's advance. Activating the rook on the queen side establishes a threat to the pawn chain's structural integrity, aiming to disrupt black's precarious hold on the position and create weaknesses for exploitation. The rook emerges from its defensive post, eyeing the newly opened diagonal towards white's king and aiming to disrupt any lingering plans for queenside expansion. The monarch now relocates to a safer square, preparing to support the rook's advancement along the opened files and potentially exploit weaknesses in black's pawn structure on the queen side. Introducing potential counterplay on the king side, this move aims to activate the h-pawn and potentially create threats against white's king, while also preventing the rook from easily occupying the 7th rank on its own. A bold push to penetrate the enemy ranks with the rook, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially fork pieces on the 7th rank. Initiating a pawn advance on the king side can be a double-edged sword, potentially creating weaknesses while seeking active play. Fortifying the kingside structure by advancing the h-pawn is a prudent step, aiming to prevent any potential backdoor infiltration by black's rook or bishop along the 7th rank, thereby adding a layer of defensive solidity. Relocating the monarch to c6 is a proactive step, aiming to consolidate its position and prepare for potential counterplay on the queen side. But it must be mindful of the open files and white's remaining active pieces, which could exploit any hesitation. Aggressively challenging black's pawn structure, g4 opens lines towards the enemy king and aims to disrupt black's queenside stability, potentially creating weaknesses for a future attack. Opening the king's path, the pawn push creates a dynamic on the queen side, potentially exposing your monarch to further threats as the passed pawn advances. Clearing the h-file opens a direct assault lane for the rook, aiming to pierce black's defenses on the king side. Relocating the monarch to b6 appears to be a preparatory repositioning, aiming to either support a pawn advance on the queen side or perhaps swing towards the center should a favorable pawn break materialize. Utilizing the open file to penetrate black's defenses, the rook now exerts pressure on the 7th rank, threatening to disrupt black's coordination and potentially isolate the king further. Shifting the rook to the 4th rank aims to activate it and eye the weak pawn on h3, potentially creating counterplay in the endgame. The king ventures into the fray, aiming to support its remaining pawns and potentially participate in the pawn race. A bold push to create a passed pawn, but it significantly weakens the king's pawn shield, opening up avenues for white's rook and knight to penetrate the black camp. The king's exposed position is a glaring weakness. A swift pawn advance could quickly sever any remaining defensive lines. Reinforcing the central pawn chain creates a more robust defensive structure for the black king. Unleashing a check on the 8th rank, white aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially force an exchange that favors them in the long run. The rook's forceful presence on the open file now compels black to react, potentially exposing their king or forcing a concession of material or positional advantage. This aggressive maneuver targets the very foundation of black's current setup, seeking to pry open lines for further attack. Embracing the endgame transition, black's king cautiously advances, seeking active participation and eyeing potential shelter on the king side, while white's rook diligently patrols the open 8th rank, poised to exploit any pawn weaknesses. This relentless check forces the black king to a precarious central position, a critical turning point where the threat of further king hunts becomes paramount. A pivotal moment arises as black's king attempts to escape the relentless checks, seeking refuge on the queen side. This maneuver highlights the stark contrast between white's dominant rook and the exposed black monarch, underscoring the immediate pressure black faces. Unleashing another forcing check, white aims to disrupt black's king's already precarious position, seeking to exploit the open files and the king's exposed nature to force further concessions or even a decisive attack. The rook's foray to the 3rd rank injects a dose of dynamism, aiming to disrupt the opponent's pawn structure and potentially fork key pieces in the ensuing skirmish. A precisely timed check forces the black king onto a more exposed square, preventing it from finding any shelter and creating opportunities for further harassment. A necessary retreat to consolidate the king's safety, acknowledging the danger of the open files and the advancing enemy pawns now that white's rook has been forced to an active square. King's safety becomes paramount as the rook swings to the 8th rank, forcing a necessary retreat and limiting the black king's movement options. King's safety finally becomes paramount as the monarch steps into the open. Forcing the opponent's king to the edge of the board with this check severely limits its mobility and sets up a potential mating net, highlighting the power of coordinated rook and king pressure in the endgame. King's safety has become a paramount concern, and this piece repositioning attempts to disrupt white's repetitive checks by seeking a more active defensive posture, potentially creating escape squares or counterplay while the king remains exposed on the dark squares. Unleashing the rook to harass, the king creates a critical check, forcing black into a defensive posture and potentially isolating their remaining pieces. The rook's persistent checking now forces the black king into a desperate position, cornered along the back rank with no safe squares. A desperate attempt to reignite the attack and exploit the exposed black king. The black king, now exposed on the 3rd rank, becomes a prime target as white continues to chase it with perpetual checks, aiming to force a draw. Forcing a perpetual check offers a way to avoid an immediate, albeit potentially messy, material loss. The king's precarious position on the queen side invites perpetual checks, a necessary evil to avoid immediate disaster as the rooks eye the central files. The rook now forces the black king onto a square where it will be repeatedly harassed by the white rook and king, aiming to either win material or force a stalemate, while simultaneously preventing the black king from supporting its passed pawn. The king finds itself in a precarious position, exposed on the queen side with limited escape routes as the rook aggressively patrols the 7th rank. Pushing the rook to the 8th rank now aims to exploit the kingside pawn structure, potentially leading to a discovered attack or forcing the black king into an even more exposed position, especially with the white rook now enjoying open access. The king's flight to safety, seeking refuge on the queen side, signals a desperate attempt to evade perpetual check, but lands him in a precarious position amidst white's encroaching pieces. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure provides a crucial defensive shield against any potential pawn breaks or infiltration from black's rook and king. Escaping the perpetual check sequence, the rook aims to find a more active square, potentially eyeing the b-file or supporting a future pawn push. Gaining the open file is paramount here. The rook now has a commanding presence on the f-file, threatening to infiltrate the black king's defenses and exploit any weakness. Exploring the rook's mobility, black offers a tempting diagonal for white's king, potentially leading to a discovered attack or forcing king repositioning. Unleashing a pawn storm, f4 aims to pry open the kingside, forcing a reaction from black's king and potentially creating weaknesses for an endgame advance. Capturing the pawn opens a diagonal for the rook and offers a potential passed pawn down the g-file, a significant endgame consideration. Sacrificing material for a decisive king hunt, the monarch is now exposed to potential mating nets. The pawn on a4 advances, a bold bid to create a passed pawn and disrupt white's queenside structure, though it concedes more space on the queen side. Initiating a decisive rook maneuver to infiltrate black's position and exploit the exposed king is a bold strategic thrust. Escaping the perpetual checking carousel, the king seeks refuge on the queen side, aiming to consolidate its presence and perhaps orchestrate a counterplay against the exposed white king. Opening up the h-file with this rook maneuver creates significant pressure along the dark squares and challenges black's pawn structure near their monarch. The immediate threat to the rook on a7 demands attention. Ignoring it invites disaster. A decisive check forcing the king into a compromised corner, highlighting the king's awkward placement and creating potential mating nets with coordinated pieces. The king seeks refuge on the queen side, a strategic repositioning to evade the relentless central pressure and perhaps find a safe haven from the encroaching rook. A forced march begins, leveraging the discovered check to herd the black king into a precarious corner. Black's king is now exposed to the mating net white has meticulously woven. Shifting the rook to this square neutralizes the immediate pawn threat while simultaneously eyeing the queenside for potential breakthroughs, offering a flexible defensive posture. Unleashing the rook from its defensive post, this maneuver aims to finally challenge White's kingside initiative and exploit the open file. Asserting control over the file with the rook immediately puts pressure on Black's advanced pawn and restricts the enemy king's potential escape routes, while also preparing for a potential rook lift to the kingside or a maneuver to support a pawn push. Prioritizing king's safety now becomes paramount as the opponent's rooks are poised for coordinated action. A slight misstep could lead to a swift checkmate. The regal check forces the black king back, a tactical geometry lesson in king hunting as White relentlessly advances. The king is exposed, scrambling to find safety behind a pawn shield that's rapidly eroding. Shifting the rook to the g-file now sets up a potential mating net, capitalizing on the black king's exposed position and the open lines created by recent pawn exchanges. Snagging that second-rank pawn opens up the potential for a decisive breakthrough, leveraging the open file to push toward promotion and presenting an immediate threat to White's king. The rook's journey concludes on the file, presenting a formidable threat to the isolated pawn and threatening to dislodge the king's sanctuary. The rook sacrifices itself to become an unstoppable passed pawn, a classic endgame maneuver where material is traded for decisive initiative. The king, no longer a passive bystander, steps into the fray, demonstrating the ultimate offensive power by snatching the distant pawn, a bold maneuver that fundamentally alters the material balance and introduces immediate endgame complexities. The king's journey to the queenside, seeking a safe haven amongst the pawns, now encounters a stark reality, exposed and vulnerable. Solidifying the pawn structure on the kingside is paramount. Pushing the g-pawn creates a protected passed pawn opportunity, leveraging the rook's active placement to support this advance. The black king scurries to safety, seeking a haven from the relentless pawn storm and the looming rook. Pushing the pawn forward here is a decisive step, aiming to advance the passed pawn and restrict the black king's maneuverability. The rook sacrifices itself for a pawn, aiming to disrupt White's king's safety and potentially force an advantageous pawn endgame if White is not careful with their king's exposed position. The king bravely advances, aiming to shepherd the remaining pawns towards promotion, transforming this pawn race into a decisive battle of king activity and initiative. The black king finally ventures out from its protective cover, a bold step into the now open central landscape, signaling an immediate shift from positional maneuvering to a more direct confrontation, aiming to leverage its newfound mobility. Unlocking the king's escape square by advancing to the 7th rank, preparing to control the open file and escorting the pawn. Swinging the rook across aims to harass the monarch, forcing it into a perpetual zugzwang where any step it takes only leads to more checks, ensuring the draw by repetition. A desperate retreat to the corner, the king is no longer a sanctuary but a target in this escalating endgame skirmish. A desperate gambit to escape the mating net, but the exposed monarch is about to face a swift reckoning. Embracing the decisive path, the pawn marches forward, aiming to solidify its newfound promotion threat and force the black king into an even tighter defensive posture. This endgame is a complex dance of forcing the king into a vulnerable position while simultaneously advancing the pawn. The black king, having ventured out from its sanctuary, now finds itself in a tight spot, facing relentless pressure from the white monarch and the ever-growing threat of the g-pawn. Every move is a careful calculation, a gamble against the advancing tide, with the fate of the game hanging on the precise coordination of remaining pieces. The king ventures out, seeking a defensive post on the kingside, but its path to safety is blocked by the encroaching enemy pawn. The black rook, abandoning its defensive post on the 7th rank, seeks to disrupt the white king's coronation by introducing a check that forces the monarch to retreat further into its own territory. The white king seeks refuge on the final rank, hoping to outmaneuver its black counterpart and create a defensive fortress. The rook advances, seeking to solidify its position on the 7th rank, a classic endgame strategy for restricting the opponent's king and potentially creating passed pawns. The white monarch finally seeks the safety of the kingside, leaving the central squares open for potential skirmishes and hinting at the endgame's inherent dangers, where every tempo counts and exposed kings can quickly fall prey to opposition. The black king, though safe behind its pawns, has achieved its final objective, to reach a position from which it can support the central pawns, a critical step in this drawn-out endgame.